Hi everyone and welcome. I know it's a really sunny day outside, so thanks for joining us. My name is Miriam Walker-Khan. I'm a freelance sports journalist and writer. I mainly work at BBC Sports, but I also do bits for Premier League productions and some magazines, and I think I recognise some people from Twitter, which is nice. So the purpose of today is for Stefan, Dan and Tom, who I'll properly introduce you to in a minute, to present their findings from a piece of work they've done, which has been exploring the lived experiences of British South Asian people in football admin, governance and managerial roles in football. And also really importantly, where you all come in, we're looking to get a bit of constructive feedback on it too. So about halfway through this session, we'll head into breakout rooms for that. But first, we're going to give you a bit of background on the research on this project and kind of why it came about. And just to say as well, if you want to post anything on social media about the event, we're using the hashtag equality is everyone's job. British Asian people are more likely to play football than white British people. But of the 4,000 professional footballers in the UK, only 0.25% are British Asian. And 93% of board members are white across Sport England UK and sport funded bodies. And despite kind of increasing numbers of British South Asian people who have relevant qualifications for managerial, administration and governance work, and outperforming other ethnic groups, a significant number are not finding equivalent employment. And we know anecdotally that there's been a small rise in the number of British South Asian people working at managerial, administration and governance levels of English football. But there's been no kind of previous attempt to locate or understand what the experiences of successful BSA people in the football industry are. So the kind of research aims of this project are to document the lived experiences of BSA people working at in those roles, to identify mechanisms enabling and disabling BSA people working or aspiring to work in those roles, and then to inform the inclusion, equality and diversity agenda across all levels of UK football, specifically policies and strategies on diversifying the workforce. So all of this research was carried out by Stefan, Dan and Tom. So a bit of info on everyone. So Dr. Stefan Lawrence is currently a senior lecturer at Newman University in sport and health and programme lead for sport and exercise studies and sport development with coaching. He's also the co-editor of the book Digital Football Cultures, Fandom, Identities and Resistance, and has written several papers on race, ethnicity and sport. Dr. Dan Kilvington is a senior lecturer in media and cultural studies at Leeds Beckett University. I think a lot of you recognise him as he's written and spoken extensively on British South Asian experiences in football over the last decade. And he's also published 5 books, including British Asians, Exclusion and the Football Industry in 2016. And Tom Fletcher is reader in the School of Events, Tourism and Hospitality Management at Leeds Beckett University and has spent over a decade researching race equality and diversity in sport and leisure, predominantly in the context of cricket. He's also the author of 5 books, including Negotiating Fatherhood, Sport and Family Practices, and Sport, Leisure and Social Justice.
Thanks very much, Mim. And again, thanks very much for taking the time to do this for us. We're really privileged to have you. Just a few acknowledgements really before we get into the gist of things, which is to thank the Leisure Studies Association who have funded this research for us. We're really thankful to them. We also wanted to acknowledge the support of the FA, of individuals at the FA that have supported us in terms of writing letters of recommendation to funding bodies. It's important to say that this isn't funded by the FA, it is an independent piece of research, but we felt that it was the right thing to do to acknowledge the support of individuals past and present. Before we get into the findings, we just wanted to give you a little bit of context about the methods that we have used, to give you a little idea of the sample and who was included and who was excluded. So we took 21 interviews, which amounted to about 36 hours of recorded testimony. So we would like to thank everybody that took part. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to make this research possible and shed light on some areas of perhaps improvement, but also considerable amount of work that's still to be done. So we were interested in speaking to those that carve out a career in the game in leadership and governance positions. So that's anything from board levels at pro clubs to having significant responsibility for teams of people in the pro game. All our interviews were conducted in the midst of the pandemic on Zoom and Teams. And we then collected the data and used thematic analysis to draw out common themes across the data. Now, the co-design participatory workshop is where we're at now. So it is important really to say that this particular research is not finished. We have done the initial thematic analysis, but we think it's a really important stage in the research process to kind of hand back to major stakeholders to say, this is what the thematic analysis has drawn out. What do you think to that? Or where might we emphasize or place priority in our final report before we get back to the final outputs that have been produced? These are the major findings that we have been able to draw out of the data. Now, a number of you that will be in the room today, and subsequently those of you that may be viewing this after the event, won't necessarily be surprised with some of the things that we've drawn out. This is the first piece of research which has sought specifically to understand the experiences of British South Asian people in governance positions, socially scientific rigorous methodology, and putting it through a socially scientific rigorous process. We think that this is beginning to turn what is anecdote and story into kind of hard evidence base for policymakers make changes. So the first theme, which is the theme that I will take, is that at the moment our data reveals that the unique experiences of British South Asian peoples and groups is often overlooked, and it's overlooked in numerous ways by the football industry. The first finding that I want to talk about really is the term BAME, and it became very clear from our respondents, across a number of respondents, that the term BAME was reducing kind of really emotive, individualized experiences to an acronym. It's something that Sporting Equals have picked up on, and it's something that our research also has revealed. We should really be challenging it. I don't like the term. BAME is quite irrelevant, actually. It doesn't tell you anything. I don't think BAME is a helpful acronym or terminology because we don't all sit under the same umbrella. And interview E12 discussing the context of Black Lives Matter, they're using the term BAME so that they can put us together. I couldn't find a black woman, but there's a brown one, but it's fine because they are both the same, which is why I hate the term. It's because you're excusing the fact that you didn't bother to look hard enough for black women. So that particular term and terminology is reducing the complex experiences of British South Asian people in the football industry to a kind of a homogenized group. However, within that, there was still a desire from our participants to speak to the individualized experiences of those from Bengali, Pakistani and Indian communities, and how they differ and how that inflects how they're treated within the football industry. Another thing we picked up on, which really speaks to this kind of diversity and heterogeneity of those communities and the nuance of that. We didn't identify Islamophobia in our testimonies, but our interviewees did identify evidence of Islamophobia within the football industry, and they became very aware that that particular form of discrimination was prevalent, and it dictated how they presented a sense of self. So those that weren't Muslim, there was evidence that they were mindful of that, as this particular testimony here on the screen evidences, but those who were also mindful of that as well. So there were certain practices that were employed by those respondents. And lastly, from me, really, is the importance of gender and looking at how, or the ways in which ethnicity also complicates that further. That's something that we picked up on. So I just think women in an industry like football are treated differently because you're just seen as somebody who could go on. With a woman, it's a bit like, well, you're a bit cocky, aren't you? Or to me, it's just the way women are perceived differently to men. I'm not the only woman, but I am the only woman of colour. And that was something that our female respondents reported in terms of the isolationism on and in kind of boardrooms and then in management cultures. And I think this one was a really powerful testimony. I question whether I got it because I'm brown. I'm a brown woman, especially now this year. Everything I've got, I'm like, of course you gave it to me. I'm a brown woman. Of course you gave it to me. And that's frustrating. I'm really good. Why would I have to question that? And when we juxtapose that against kind of the experiences that perhaps some of the research team have, that's just not kind of the emotional energy just isn't expended on thinking that. So that's something that we need to delve into a little bit further. Yeah, it's over to you, Dan.
Right, so it is over to me. Again, exactly as Mim said earlier, thanks very much for joining us. Now, this section, picking up from what Stefan has said, and this football family, it's often called this football family, which sounds really nice and inclusive, doesn't it? There are ways of feeling ostracized. There are ways and microaggressions that lead to feeling silenced. These stereotypes that make people feel othered. And those really came out of the 21 interviews that we had. So the way that we kind of term this is feeling both inside and outside of the football family at the same time. So, first of all, the first one is this idea of feeling different, not only feeling different, but being made to feel different at times and made to feel othered because of your identity, because of your name, because of your religion, because of your cultural background. So for me as a white male, nobody really gets my name wrong. That's a privilege that I have. But when you are British South Asian, the amount of interviewees that say my name gets butchered, people get my name wrong all the time. And as the first interviewee says at the top there, it doesn't really bother them. But when you're just about to go out and talk in front of 100 people and somebody butchers your name or somebody keeps getting your name wrong time and time again, it's that another layer that you've got to deal with on top of going out and doing your job. I'll read this one out in full because this is a really clear example of a microaggression, and they all add up. So it might seem as very subtle, it might seem as harmless, but if this keeps happening time and time again inside this football family, you are made to feel different, you are made to feel othered. So I'm extremely passionate, especially when I speak about things that I care about. I get told a lot when I'm in the middle of a passionate rant or conversation or diatribe that, oh, it's so funny, your accent gets really Indian when you get excited. And that happens to me all the time. I'm right in the middle of arguing my point. What do you think that is going to do to my point? Because immediately I stop and I'm like, right, okay, where was I? That's a microaggression. Right, so the next one is, so I think historically there's still a degree to it. It's a little bit cliquey. That idea that inside football, you're part of the in crowd. And if you're not part of the in crowd, you're excluded and you can be made to feel excluded. And this links to the overarching literature, how football and how sport is often run through these networks. And there's a load of research that's been done about networks of white to white networks. And if you're outside those networks and you don't get on the so-called merry-go-round, as one interviewee said, then you're always going to struggle. You always feel like you're on the fringes. And that final one as well, the use of a badge metaphor, I thought was quite interesting. So when you walk into the room, people already have an assumption of you. So you are othered in somewhere because of your physical appearance, because of your background. And for some people, it's an instinctive judgment. Not only are you judged on your physical appearance, you're also judged by the organization that you represent as well. What this then tends to do is the idea of feeling different leads to changing or affecting your performances in some way. So you end up diluting or downplaying aspects of your identity. And that's what a number of interviewees said throughout this research process. So it's diluting an aspect of your personality, downplaying an aspect of your culture or religious identity in order to so-called fit in to the football family and succeed. Again, and I really like this particular phrase there, you have to flex your communication style in order to suit the environment that you're working in. So you're constantly navigating these different spaces. And for a lot of the interviews we spoke to, actually downplaying aspects of your identity as well. The Indian culture, to look someone in the eyes is seen as rude, you have to respect authority. There's certain things that I'm having to navigate culturally and change your styles or flex your communication styles. I can literally think back to comments now where I've met people socially who were not in Football Network who said, do you like cricket? And again, that does fit into here because it's very much these stereotypical assumptions, linking back to what we said before, these instant assumptions that people generally tend to make. And by people, I'm saying, you know, whites who are stereotypically assuming that you must like cricket, even though you might not have any desire or love for the game. And the next one I think is a really interesting one as well. So I come from a Punjabi background, and the Punjabi kind of culture and identity, it's loud, it's vivacious, have a good time, work hard, but also have fun at the same time. And one of the ways which the interviewee says that in the kind of Punjabi culture, a way to ease the tension is to make jokes, to make things lighthearted, as it says, especially for our benefit, to ease the tension in some way. And that's a big aspect of this interviewee's personality, to have a good time, to kind of be informal at times as well. And that's part of that culture. But when this interviewee has tried to actually get their real personality, which is informed by their cultural upbringing, when they've tried to get that out, they're almost seen as ostracized in some way, or looked down upon in some way. So if you come in and you bring your true identity and your true background, even if that's seen as a positive in your eyes and your culture, it's often misunderstood within certain social spaces and within the so-called football family as well. So yeah, the next one is this idea of subservience as well. And this is, a few people actually mentioned this within the process. And what we have there is that, again, microaggressions, that the subtle looks and the subtle things, it's not always words. Microaggressions can be kind of body language as well. And again, a number of participants echoed these types of feelings in the research process. That sort of movement in the head and face, you think, why not anyone else? Everyone was respected. They looked at me differently, but it was almost like, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't be here, or God, you're lucky to be in this position. You're lucky to be in this role. And I was almost grateful. I almost felt like a subservient, grateful person to everyone just to be there. Even though that final point in the quote is, yeah, I look at some of those and think, you can't do half of what I can do. So even though you've got interviewees here, and remember who we're interviewing, admin, governance, and senior managerial positions within the game of football, what came through in the research was this idea of being subservient and just being grateful to have a job in football, even though in many cases, the people that we interviewed were incredibly well qualified and absolutely deserved the job that they were in, but being made to feel gracious just to have that job. And interviewee 11 actually echoes that as well in the final quote. So the way I've kind of succeeded in achieving anything within sports environment is almost as acting subservient to the people at the top. You go out to impress them, you know, thank you, I'm so grateful to you. And that came through in a number of them. It's about being subservient, but then it also leads to feeling silenced in many situations. So, for example, a number of participants talked about the fact that if they speak out against seeing or witnessing or observing these microaggressions, or in some cases outright blatant overt racism or casual racism, I'm always worried about being outspoken, speaking out about these things, because for some interviewees, they don't want to be seen as playing this so-called race card. It's easier to just stay quiet, keep your head down, and get on with things. So as interviewee 19 says, be quiet, what would you know? I also like that final bit of the quote there. It's exhausting, you have to pick your fights. And anybody who is vehemently anti-racist or against discrimination in any way, the emotional investment and labor that we put into challenging it, that word is true, exhausting. It is exhausting. And for a lot of people in the game, they're actually picking their battles and picking their fights and having to do that. This story, which was, we had a Muslim lad, really nice lad working with us, and we went to a day out for the football club, and it was at the dogs. One of the dogs was called Bomber. This lady went up to the Muslim lad and said, I take it you'll be putting money down for him, the Bomber. And he came up to me and said, "You're not going to believe what she's said to me." He ended up reporting that, but then the person who we reported it at the football club, they had a word with the perpetrator. They denied it, said it wasn't racist, said it was a bit of fun, a bit of banter, and nothing was done. And the Muslim individual ended up leaving the football club. And then the final one here, again, it's quite revealing that even at the boardroom level, that casual racism is just being thrown out there. And the individual that we spoke to here said that certain things and certain cultures would be kind of made fun of, and stereotypes were being thrown out there. And he ended up just nodding and agreeing with it because it was the easy thing to do rather than speak out about it. And I think that football family, even though it sounds, family sounds really nice, really inclusive, that's not the experience in the game. It's feeling silenced, it's feeling othered. And maybe these experiences and things that I've spoken about over the last few slides resonate with some people listening to this. And so, yeah, that's it from me. And next is over to Tom, who's going to go through the third and fourth research theme.
Thanks, Dan. I think what we'll tend to find is that there is inevitable crossover. So the third thing that we've talked about is around recruitment and progression, and in particular around barriers to recruitment and progression. Generally speaking, participants felt that getting into football was incredibly difficult. Many had taken pay cuts from other industries. They'd waited a very long time. They'd taken on voluntary roles and things like that. Once they were in, so getting in was very difficult. And then once they were in, as Dan identifies, they experienced a series of microaggressions, outright racism, etc. And that many felt that progression was inhibited as a result of that. Now, this is an experience that is, not everybody experiences these things in the same way. And of course, some experiences are more kind of overtly negative or overtly positive to others. So we've tried to capture what we've got within our data. There are positive stories inevitably as well, and I think that's important to identify too. The first area that I wanted to work through was this idea of lack of trust. A lack of trust in the system, which was often couched within terms of, we don't think that football is for us, or it's not, there are no careers in football for people like us, and that there were a series of barriers identified, which were, some of them were specific to British South Asians, others were more generic across, whether it be ethnically diverse groups, but there were things that were very specific as well, particularly around family socialization and the kind of intergenerational nature of feeling excluded. And you'll tend to find that we had participants that talked about other experiences of family members and how that message, they'd grown up with the message that actually football is not for you, and therefore that created a barrier for them too. So in this case, interview 18 talked about the experiences of her father. She said, "My father felt it," referring to racism. "I don't know whether it was overt, but it certainly was overt when he started applying for jobs." Talks here about removing his turban, for instance, in order to apply for and having a haircut in order to get through the door and to not be perceived as different. So that was back then, but I think he feared that he didn't want me to face difficulties in the chosen profession I'd gone to, and hence thought it might be better for me to do pharmacy or accountancy or something like that. Of course, pharmacy and accountancy, as we know, are very easy professions to get into. But I think it was striking, this idea of going into fairly stereotypical jobs, that these were often self-imposed on the basis of, we don't feel that the industry is for us. We don't feel that it is accessible. And that is resonates further down. Interview 14 talks about how the system is basically rigged against British South Asian people. He says that the reason why there aren't Asian people who are investing a lot of time and energy into football, both on the playing side, the coaching side, or the administration side, is because at the moment it doesn't seem like it's feasible. Asian people know that football is not designed to allow them to succeed in their career. We know it because we don't see people like us getting big opportunities. And this resonates with interviewee 15, who again referring to family socialization, said that one thing my dad told me from an early age is that sport is not going to be a career. You don't even think about it. He says, I got nothing out of it, and he was good, and you're not going to get anything out of it either. So think of that. There's also a view that whilst these barriers exist, that there was a culture, unsurprisingly, that revolved around nepotism. that this was very much an industry where you look out for your mate, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And I don't think it will come as a surprise, but to see the testimonies and to listen to people and talk about their experiences, it's really quite striking how strongly this came through. So interview 14 says that football likes to hire people who've already worked in lots of football clubs and have a brand name or have been ex-players. And the headhunters, they circulate the same people round and round. So you've got to try and break into that system of being on the inside. But if you're not a player, and we know that Asian people don't get that far, you're not going to get in. So they're saying that the system, again, talking about this system is rigged. Interviewee 19 outsips, it's based on nepotism. It still is. It's about your mates' mates. It still is. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm going through it, and they talk about a particular advocate of theirs. I'm going through other people that I know. That's the way it is. There is a normalization that it revolves around a certain network of people. If you've got access to that network, then you can proceed, you can access, and you can progress. But as we know, those networks are based around a particular part of the system, that often British South Asian people are not part of, or they don't know how to navigate necessarily. Therefore, that network is often cut off. Interviewee 6 says that those jobs, talking about professional boardroom type and more senior roles, says those jobs just come up. And for what people have told me, and when you do, it's very much like you've said, I'll look after my mate, you scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. And one of the things that seemed to come through quite strongly was the role of recruitment agencies in facilitating this nepotism. And we feel quite strongly that this is something that is fairly original in terms of the discussions that we've had, I suppose knowledge of the current literature that's out there, is that the role of recruitment agencies isn't a factor in the academic research so far. And this is an area that we'd really like to explore further. So interviewee 2 says that now it's slightly different. The higher up in executive jobs, you've got the recruitment agencies, and they say that you might be missed because you don't get that opportunity to go directly to show what you can do. In other words, if the agencies aren't coming sniffing around you, you just don't get through the door. You don't get an opportunity to showcase your talent. And we had examples where participants, our interviewees, they were incredibly deflated and demotivated by these experiences. The effect of that was that often the participants would feel quite ostracized. They wouldn't necessarily go for opportunities that they felt they were perfectly well qualified for, or indeed they got frustrated by seeing other people progress into those roles. So this participant says that my experience is I've given up with recruitment agencies a long time ago. They'd send their CV, they'd ask for some feedback, they would never hear back from the recruitment agency, despite the fact that they were very, very well qualified and very talented. Same here with interviewee 2, I just didn't hear back. I recently was going to apply for two further roles, and I didn't, because I suppose I might have a perception, a wrong one maybe, that it's not worth applying because it's going to go to a recruitment agency. Now, these are telling, clearly that whilst there are clearly very, very talented people amongst our within our participant group, that they don't feel valued by the system, even though their prior experience clearly warrants progression or even access to certain parts of the industry, that they question their legitimacy and they question their talent as well. And we talk about advocates as well, not necessarily white advocates, but having people within the system who can open doors. So this participant said, I just said to one of their advocates, can you give me 20 minutes of your time one day? I'd like to work in sports. I'm in the process of kind of managing a career trajectory, a life trajectory towards that goal. I'd love to pick your brains. And they were very kind. So he literally went out of his way to make introductions, and it just went from there. I'm going to balance that up with this one, and then I'll skip the latter one because of time. This interview 9 refers to a particular person, says that they've been a godsend. There's a lot of good people out there, and specifically saying that are white people that are supporting me in football and helping me. People that have helped me have been white. So I want to say that genuinely, and I want to say that on record, my mentors are white. So let's balance this. And this is important, the role of white advocates as well. Not just white advocates, but having that network, that level of, I suppose, cognitive diversity as well, whereby people are surrounded by people who are different from them, but have different networks to them as well, and therefore can open different doors. But there was also suspicion amongst participants, suspicion that the football industry is not necessarily committed to making changes and making themselves more inclusive. And we term this interest convergence in that we suggest that where changes do occur or are likely to happen, that this is most likely to occur when it's in the interest of the football industry. So this, interview 18, this particular participant referring to the in the aftermath of the Eni Aluko case, says that the FA was slaughtered as a result of that. They wanted to be seen to be changing things. They wanted to be seen. So many organisations are driven by guilty feeling when it comes to diversity. And then there will be clubs who have signed up to the diversity code who've done it because they think, I can't not sign up because we'll look like we're against it and then we're not inclusive and we're racist. And then finally, interviewee 12 says it's sad that that there is this code. It's sad that we have to force people to look at equality, but there are more opportunities because they're being forced to. And this brings us on to those people that do make their way through and that they are in the system. Many of you, many of the people who are listening to this presentation now, you will probably feel what we've referred to as a burden of representation, whereby you feel that you are a lone voice. You're a trailblazer, but your voice is often the only ethnically diverse person around that table. Often you may well be the only woman around that table, and certainly the only woman of an ethnically diverse background around that table. So this participant says, I'm the only Asian person really. Even up in senior management level, I'm the only Asian face, apart from one other chap. And because they're in the minority, because they're that only Asian face, I think I am the mouthpiece for a lot of those in the Asian community who need help in thinking, well, how do I get to work in the football industry? I've taken on that role because I feel like I need to, and because I'm privileged enough in order to affect change. Interviewee 12, and this participant says, that's a microaggression. Asking me to speak on behalf of an entire gender, race, population, subsection, I can't do that. I can only speak for my own experience, and my experience as a brown Asian woman in sport is still not the same as the next. I would never assume that of you. I would never say to you, how do all Scottish men think? How the hell would you know? You're not Scottish. And so you tend to find that because of these positions of being the lone voice, often there was a feeling that their voice was not valued, but that lack of value was probably personified by how many stated how their work within football, advocating on behalf of race equality, was done voluntarily. This was not through formal roles. It certainly wasn't in formal, powerful roles. And therefore, we're tapping into this idea of unpaid, but also quite emotional labour. This participant says, how many have actually made a career out of it in terms of paid roles? How many have transferred that experience into a career? It's largely been voluntary. Interviewee 19 says, I've donated over 150 days of my time. That's because I want to do it. And then finally, interviewee 19 says, we're all contracted to do this work. Everyone working in football is contracted to do this work. Although I don't think I took a penny anyway. I never claimed my money. Other people did, but I didn't feel it was appropriate. I was doing it for the love of it. And this was part of a wider kind of discourse around a sense of commitment to the cause. Where our participants felt that they had a voice or they had a role, that often they were pigeonholed into certain parts of the industry, and that other parts of the industry were cut off from them. So generally speaking, participants talked about how it was fairly normal for British South Asians to work in medical departments, team doctors, physios, etc., and then similarly working in equality and diversity roles and taking on the mantle to be that voice, that lone voice for equality and diversity. And I loved this one mainly because my background was cricket, and I thought, I can imagine having this conversation. And this person said, after I'd left a particular football club, the rumour that went very quickly around the organisation was apparently that I was working in cricket now. I mean, how much more stereotypical can you get, right? But it's not true at all. I'd be happy to be working in cricket, but it's not true. And I haven't even applied for a role in cricket. So God knows how that started.
We're going to quickly feedback from each group. So Dan, actually, do you want to feedback from ours? Because I noticed you writing things down and I was.
Yeah, I was. As a group, we reacted to what the findings were. We talked about the importance of intersectionality and how that probably needs to be a bit more prominent within the research. I think we also spoke about meritocracy, and I think how one way to really challenge and make sure that we can enforce and enact positive changes to really destabilize that idea of meritocracy, which we all know is a myth. It doesn't exist. But I think for those, especially in the higher echelons, they might believe in a meritocracy that's not real. We also spoke, and I had a couple of offers within my breakout room as well, which was nice, about how to actually help and assist with the research, but also how to disseminate the research to wider networks beyond today, which is really, really brilliant to hear. In terms of recommendations, I think, again, going back to what Stefan started with, which was the idea that BAME is not useful. Problems that affect each group, but also understand that racism is a problem. Inequalities affect all communities, all groups. Also, we spoke about the idea that if we are going to see change at the top and actually have people take this seriously in high positions, it's that idea of opportunity rather than responsibility. And I think that was quite a nice quote. So it's an opportunity for people at the top to change, possibly for monetary benefits that they can make. They can tap into an untapped market. Of course, we know that there are moral responsibilities, but again, to get people on side, if there's targets there, if there's monetary opportunities, they're more likely to take it. And again, through my research with various football clubs in the past, that is something that comes out through that research, where the people at the top are more likely to engage if they can get something out of it.
Yeah, it does feel like diversity, or like the D word, is often seen as a problem more than something positive that we should be celebrating. Obviously with these findings, it's not great, but does feel like a problem for a lot of people. Steph.
So I'm happy to feedback. So some of the things similar to the term BAME really isn't necessarily very helpful, and we should look to move away from it. There was a very healthy debate about quotas as well, about how do we actually change things and how do we make things better. Yeah, which it always is, and actually I always find that a fascinating debate. For what it's worth, I think quotas are that radical way that we can make change, but I'm also mindful that there are different positions to that. Football is a completely different beast to other industries. We've got some going yes, some going no. So okay, that's good to kind of get that feedback as well, to say that there are some similarities but some differences. I think that's important. The messaging of whatever goes out is really important, and I think that's what you were alluding to a little bit, guys, in terms of making this as opposed to, or reframing diversity not necessarily as a problem but a solution. I think that's really important, and that's a great contribution. And also, what gets measured gets done. And I saw it in the comments, that there was that question of, is our sample size enough? We would argue, for social scientists, we were going, wow, we've got like 21 respondents and 36 hours of data. That's not too far off a PhD for sociology. So I think it's kind of at the same time acknowledging that there are those disparities, and that framing feeds into the messaging to say, well, actually, 21, 36 hours in-depth interviews with a group of people that aren't overrepresented. We looked at our sample size and went, we're quite happy that is kind of representative because of the limited number of people that we perhaps could speak to that fit our criteria. But we're mindful that other paradigms would want more data. So I think we can perhaps go away if we get time and more resource to do that. That would be great, but the practicalities of doing it. And we are very mindful of this. This is one of the reasons why the co-design participatory workshop is happening. But also, how do we as academics, and how does the system, at the university system, more broadly, how do we colonize the university so more people of colour are able to attain kind of positions within the academic institutions to produce this research to be, so it's not the likes of me, Tom and Dan, because me and Dan Birdsey, there's been Artie Ratner as well, who's also produced stuff, and there's a number of others that I could name, but it has been kind of white guys doing this, and that's not necessarily to devalue it, but it is to say that what are we doing as part of our day job to ensure that the opportunities are kind of more widely dispersed, because we do have an issue within higher education of lack of opportunities.
Tom, your group, were you the designated feedbacker?
I was not, because we had Shelley Alexander's doppelganger, Minesh, was our designated spokesperson. So if he's happy to feedback, then that would be awesome.
I made a decision, I'll stick to it as a referee, that's what I do. So thanks everybody for your contributions. So yeah, no, just not dissimilar to what the other two speakers have said, really. I think it's fair to say that I echo the fact that the sample size was recognised as small, and you know, there's a great question: what happens next? Lack of progress, and so Thomas chucked that back in the room, because that was a question for the room, really. How do we actually fix this? How do we fix the problem? Is essentially, you know, we know there's a problem, but we need some solutions. So the more sort of questions really came from that. So was it an educational piece? You know, is it back down to the parents? You know, in terms of participation, is participation a problem? And participation is a problem, because if we're not getting the game to grow from your under fives, and as they grow older, then, you know, within grassroots, we're not going to get people playing, coaching, refereeing, and everything else. You know, is this issue just in football? And the issue with that is you know, the majority of the group can only speak for football, because that's what they breathe, sleep, eat, and everything else. And it certainly resonates with me that football is in your face. Football is more visible. Football is more touchable than your other sports. But the question that Tom asked is, you know, is this actually an issue in rugby, in tennis, in badminton, cricket? Well, they may have the same issues, but actually football is what we're here today about to discuss, and actually it's more present within football in terms of lack of participation and lack of diversity. So again, the terminology was raised, you know, in terms of BME, and I wrote down ethnically diverse communities was something that somebody mentioned within our group, which I thought was a great word, really, in terms of, you know, how we could actually change the word from BME to ethnically diverse communities. But then also, is this just a tick box? You know, it's okay, I put a smiley face next to, we get an interview, but we get a sad face when we don't actually get the job. So, you know, when we're talking about the FA need to hit their targets, well, if we meet the criteria, of course we're going to get the interview, but we're not going to get the job, which is ultimately what we actually want. And then, of course, you know, if you're, you know, in terms of a practical solution, could we actually stop funding? Could we actually stop giving county FAs fines and penalties and some severe sanctions if they're not diversifying their own boards, or even diversifying the catchment areas in terms of where they actually serve the public? Which I think I'm a great advocate of that. Sitting on the IAG, you know, I will challenge our chief executive and open and say that they need to be held accountable, and that the funding is stopped, or there is a percentage decline in their funding if they're not hitting in their diversifying their sort of targets. But then finally, I want to leave you with, you know, again, change doesn't affect the people that are accountable and can actually affect and make these things happen. And that's the problem. They're not here today. And you know, when it comes down to the actual dealing with the problem, is it just a tick box, or, you know, are they actually going to do something about it?
I think the main things I wrote down here were were around accountability. So where is it, and who is accountable for it? How do you ensure accountability? And, you know, you talked about, you know, targets, fines, sanctions, etc., etc. But to be honest, most of our discussion revolved around, I suppose, the idea of commitment. You know, whether football actually is committed to change, or whether as a result of Black Lives Matter, etc., whether they've been forced to acknowledge a problem that clearly exists, but the people that can actually enforce the change, whether they do care about this, or whether it is a case of being seen to be doing.
This was one of the questions that was asked, what are the outputs and what are we doing with this? So the final report at the moment, and this is what we're talking about when you talk about resource, really, the final report will be a hard copy. We'll be sending that out. Still trying to make sure that we've got some money to make sure that we can print the hard copies off and get them all out to the pro clubs and to other major stakeholders. But there'll also be a digital resource free to everybody that will be hosted on on the web somewhere. So we'll keep you posted with that. The peer reviewed journals bit is we're hoping to produce a number of peer-reviewed journal articles. Again, not just so it's kind of a pretentious academic exercise, but it serves as a an authoritative, socially scientific that's out there and that's reviewed by other expert scholars in the area. Conversation pieces in the media that will be reaching out to some of our links in the media with kind of the results of the report. If anyone has any links or anyone wants to help us with that, then that would be great. Some blog posts across our funders' websites and perhaps some of our own personal blogs and academic conferences and industry conferences. But as we put here at the very end, if you would like us to come along and to present this research as part of your own forums, then we'd really like you to get in touch with us about that, because as we've said before, kind of it is about making change as opposed to the research monies that we've got from the Leisure Studies Association was very, very small, but they're a small organisation. But to get money to do this kind of work is very difficult. So we were really privileged that they were able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely, Steph. I think that's something that we'll flag up straight away. These aren't our three white male privileged academics views. This is very much coming out of the research. So we're using our 21 interviews of 36 hours of data to compile the general themes and ideas around what should happen next. What are the policy recommendations? What are the recommendations? How does the industry and the football family need to change for the better to become more inclusive? And that really does bring us to the end of today, actually. So on the next slide, we have a little thank you. And again, on behalf of Steph and Tom and Mim, we just want to say thank you very much for joining us. We've been on this project for about a year now, done all these interviews, which were really enjoyable and some quite hard to do, not only for us, but for the participants as well. So we'd like to say thank you very much to the interviewees who've given up their time to speak to us. And thanks to Mim, thanks for joining us today and hosting the session. And thanks to every one of you who attended and participated in the co-design workshops.
We do have a hand up.
Yes, it's Amish.
Sorry, I should have kind of kept that down so to let you finish off on such a positive note. It was really a couple of things. One was, personally, I don't think it's a bad thing that this was done by three white men. I think it's a good thing. It shows that there's hope for the whole world, because this whole common concept of just because it was done by three white men, it's not a positive thing. I think it is, because that does show that there's people who are interested in changing things from their context. So thank you. The other thing that I wanted to just ask a question on was in the research, and maybe even Aaron might be the best person to answer this. Is there an association or a interest group or a pressure group that looks after the interests of people from different backgrounds working in football? I mean, we have the PFA, the LMA. There are trade unions and pressure groups that look after people's interests. Is there one for people who come from diverse backgrounds, or there's women in football, I think, which does a lot of good work. Is there one for other people?
Is there anyone from Sporting Equals left with us? So we have the BASPA group.
We've also got Aaron as well.
BASPA group.
Oh, yeah, the BASPA group at Sporting Equals. It's worth reaching out for those that want to get involved.
Okay, that helps. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, we have got a number of people who are, football, but actually quite a few on the BASPA group are football related. So yeah, definitely the Sporting Equals, and it is the ethnically diverse communities. The concept that the Sporting Equals developed and have shared that with everybody, and we think it's a good thing, good step forward.
Okay, then I'll look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, it was great to thank you all for doing the research, and it was lovely to hear from everyone. And also just to say, like, if anyone ever has a story that you feel needs to be told, then, and even if it's anonymously, then let me know, because I do quite a lot of stories on this kind of stuff. So It was lovely to meet you. Thank you, and go and enjoy the sunshine.